Welcome back, everyone, to Wednesday Inspirational Book Lounge. I'm your host, Anna Murby. Today's guest is Hubert Carl. Hubert and Diane Carl were married for 45 years. They both were involved with ministering to the deaf before they met. After graduating from Sacramento Bible Institute in the early 1980s, they worked with biblical ministries worldwide for almost 20 years. During that time, they spent 10 years in Los Angeles, living in an apartment complex set up for meeting the needs of the deaf-blind. They went on to minister in a deaf church near Sacramento. Diane battled cancer for 30 years, and the Lord used her sickness to lead many people to Himself. She was taken home to be with the Lord on July 13th, 2024. Hubert is also a published writer on marriage counseling. Enjoy this week's installment of 10 Famous Evangelists, read by Hubert Carl.
Ten Famous Evangelists by Basil Miller, published by Zondervan Publishing House, 1947, read by Hubert Carl. Chapter 6, Peter Cartwright, Backwoods Evangelist. Peter Cartwright stands unsurpassed as America's backwood camp meeting preacher. His spiritual power, native wit, and ability to handle ruffians who would break up the meetings made him famous around the world. No other preacher ever held so many successful camp meetings. God called him for a specific purpose, to evangelize pioneer America in the westward trend towards the Mississippi River. Across these Midwest states, his voice rang with the gospel for 50 years under brush arbor and camp shed, calling multitudes to Christ. During this time, literally tens of thousands accepted Jesus as their Savior, who were otherwise never would have heard the gospel. Peter was born in Virginia on September 9th, 1785, of poor parentage. His mother was a Methodist of the early stamp, and his father was an unbeliever. Soon the family trekked westward across the mountains to Kentucky, where they were cut off from the outside world. Here they grew all their food, raised cotton from which Mother Cartwright homespun their clothing. There were no schools, so Peter did not receive any formal education. Occasionally, a traveling Methodist preacher would visit their cabin with stories of Christ. "I was naturally a wild and wicked boy," writes Peter later in his life, "and delighted in horse racing, card playing, and dancing. My father restrained me but little, though my mother often talked to me and wept over me and prayed for me, often drawing tears from my eyes. And though I wept under preaching and resolved to do better and seek religion, yet I broke my vows, went into young company, rode races, played cards, and danced. As civilization advanced, churches sprang up, and a school was opened. Peter went in for book learning for a short while, during which time he learned to read and write. At this time, a camp meeting was held in Cane Ridge that lasted for weeks and drew thousands of people to it. During this meeting, wild and rollicking Peter was converted and joined the Methodist Church, and shortly he took great interest in camp meeting revivals and religion. In 1802, when he was 17, he was licensed to preach, and his salary was stated as $40 a year, much of which he was forced to take in produce for himself and his horse. At this time, he began holding camp meetings, and before 2 years had passed, he was famous as an evangelist of this type. He was a rough young fellow, dressed in ill-fitting clothes, with long shaggy hair tumbling over his forehead. Yet God's glory radiated from his face and touched souls when he stood to pronounce the message laid upon his heart. Those meetings in which Peter became a leading light was filled with excitement. When the people became converted or touched by the Spirit, they shouted, wept, prayed aloud, and praised God in song to the top of their voices. The encampment was lit up, Cartwright tells us. The trumpet blown, I rose to the stand. I requested my brethren, if they had ever prayed in their lives, to pray now. My text was, the gates of hell shall not prevail. In about 30 minutes, the power of God fell on the congregation in such a manner as seldom seen. The people fell in every direction. It was supposed that not less than 300 fell like dead men in mighty battle. For there was no need for calling of mourners, for they were strewn all over the campground. Loud wailing went up to the heaven from sinners crying for mercy, and a general shout from Christians, so that the noise was heard far off. Success marked his early work, and in 1812, when 20, he was appointed presiding elder, and 3 years later was elected as delegate to the General Conference of the Methodist Church. For more than 60 years, he served as presiding elder and as a delegate visiting every conference during that time. Each 6 weeks, he made the rounds of his circuit and conference, visiting each church, preaching, holding revivals, presiding at business meetings, and seeing hundreds of souls converted. In 1833, Peter ran for Illinois Legislature and had the distinction of beating Abraham Lincoln for the position. And 9 years later, rough and tumble preacher that he was, Kinry College gave him an honorary title of Doctor of Divinity, though this had little influence over his style of preaching. His success was no more amazing than his grit. Once he started a training school where the tuition was $5 a month, if paid in advance, and if the student did not have money, they could trade in produce. He was liberally endowed with much of the common sense which put Abraham Lincoln in the president's chair. He came out of the same country which produced the noble Abe. Many times in riding his circuit, he had to defend his life against Indians and wolves. Sleep on the ground, it was not an uncommon thing for him to swim the swollen rivers to make his appointments. Life in his day was hard, pioneers a difficult lot for preachers or laymen, and Peter was endowed with a burly body sufficient for the demands of his time. He received little he did not fight for. Methodists in his day were a hated lot, as also were camp-meeting preachers, and they were called upon to defend their right to sober and orderly meetings. When it became necessary for him to fight, he did not hesitate. Once 2 fighting, husky country boys decided they would break up Peter's meeting when he came to their community. Just as the preacher arose to announce his text, they turned the building into a roughhouse. The preacher quietly climbed over the seats, grabbed the 2 rowdies in the arms and shook them, and then led them to the door and pushed them outside. Henceforth, there were no more breakings of his meetings. He was not afraid of bishops, and often thundered against them to their faces in the general conferences. Lincoln once attended a Cartwright meeting, and when the preacher closed, he called all who wanted to go to heaven to stand. Lincoln remained in his seat, and Peter, not to be outdone by the budding politician, asked, "Where do you want to go?" "To Congress," honest Abe quietly responded, much to Peter's amazement. Stonewall Jackson attended one of the preacher's revivals, and someone told Cartwright that the warrior was in the audience. Peter shouted, "Stonewall Jackson will go to hell the same as any other sinner unless he repents." He was a man for the generation he served and the country he evangelized. His age and land demanded a rough and tumble type of leader, and God found his man in Cartwright. Once while traveling in a rural community, he was forced to spend the night in a home where a dance was held. As the dance progressed, he quietly sat in one corner of the room until a beautiful young girl came and asked him to dance with her. Not to be outdone, the preacher arose, promised to do so, providing she would dance with him. Reading the people, he knew many of them had never heard a sermon. He was determined that it was God's time to give him a revival in this community. Hence, he was willing to go to the extreme limits to break up the dance with a glorious revival of divine power. Walking with the girl to the middle of the room, he said to the fiddler, "Wait a moment. I make it a habit to take the Lord with me in all I do. Let us kneel and pray." Falling on his knees as he gripped the girl's hand tightly, he began calling on God. The fiddler ran to the kitchen. The young dancing partner began to cry and ask God to have mercy on her soul. Some of the people were so frightened that they ran away, but others wept. In a short while, the entire room was turned into a prayer meeting. 15 people were powerfully converted, as he expressed it, and soon a church was organized, from which came a number of Methodist preachers. Once in a conference meeting in Boston, Cartwright was asked to preach at a highfalutin church, as he termed it. Arising, when the organ pealed forth, he said, "Stop that squealing you have up there in the gallery. We don't worship God in the West by proxy or substitution." He rolled up his sleeves, unbuttoned his collar, and began to preach the same as though he were in Kentucky Brush Arbor meeting. In many of his meetings, people fell down with the jerks, when sinners would be struck with a convulsive twitching. Often they would tumble to the ground and remain as dead for hours. In fact, some men did die under his preaching when they refused to obey God. Peter looked with favor upon the time when the jerks seized the sinners, for he believed such were God's judgments sent upon them. He loved these meetings, for he had been converted in such a one, where 25,000 were assembled. Likewise, he organized, during the 65 years of his ministry, hundreds of camps, where God's power came in such demonstrations. He had a sense of humor, and though uneducated, he was not to be defeated in an argument. Once an educated minister, visiting his section, sought to outdo the backswood preacher with a show of learning. He spoke to Peter in Greek before a public audience, and Cartwright replied in German, which the minister mistook for Hebrew. Later, when he returned to his own congregation, he told them that Peter Cartwright was the only educated Methodist that he had ever met. At the end of his career, he became Methodism's most revered preacher, and for 60 years he served as a presiding elder, a record unmatched by any other minister. His voice, lifted up in the General Assembly for 50 years, was powerful, able to fill the largest auditoriums as it had been able to hold the attention of 25,000 gathered in the woods of Kentucky or Illinois. And when he preached, his voice became fiery in denunciation of sin, yet filled with tender pathos when speaking of God's love. Towards the end of his life, he spent 3 months each year lecturing in the East for his Western work. In one 3-month period, he raised $7,000 by this means, while in another time he was given 15 cents, and by way of expenses, a dozen apples. When he wrote his autobiography, it became a national bestseller. In May 1868, while attending his last conference, he arose and with shaggy hair whipping, wrinkled face twisted in a smile, and voice enfeebled by 83 years of his age, he said, "Yet if you have listened to my few words, and any of you can beat them, come up and try. A lazy minister is a curse to the Church of God. Ministers are raised in hothouses now." A glowing tribute was paid to him in 1871 when the papers of the East said, "No man has done as much for any other cause as Peter Cartwright has done for the West." Lingering a year longer on a September morning in 1872, he quietly went to sleep in Jesus, to be buried in Pleasant Plains, Illinois, where on his monuments are these words, "Trust ye in the Lord forever, for in the Lord Jehovah there is everlasting strength." God, through his providence, raised Peter Cartwright, the backwoods boy, to heights of renown that he might spread the gospel message through the western wilderness.
Thank you for tuning in. Come back next week for another installment of 10 Famous Evangelists, read by Hubert Carl. This is Wednesday Inspirational Book Lounge with Anna Murby.